Okay, everybody. This is going to be a brief video. It actually won't be that brief, and I apologize for that. It's going to be a video about the topic of personal identity, because this is being made to help you understand the Bernard Williams article, which you'll be quizzed on, which, if I recall correctly, will be relevant to some final exam questions. Okay, so let's look at at the topic of personal identity. Um, the basic idea is that when looking at this topic, we want to know what allows a person to continue existing. Or to put another way, I think a little bit more straightforward way, what are the conditions under which a person will continue to exist? There are several different contexts in which this can come up, in which you can be sort of prompted to start thinking about this question, which the way I just put it, you might think like, who cares? Like, why ask this question? Why should I want an answer? And I'll tell you why to care, but I'll do it after making a preliminary explanation of an important, two important facts about each of these words. I'm going to start with identity. Uh, we use the word identity in a lot of different ways. We meaning contemporary speakers of English in modern, you know, Western culture. One way we use it is the sense in which it's used when people talk about their gender identity, their ethnic identity, their racial identity, their religious identity. What they mean there is, by identity, is they're signaling a group they belong to that they think is particularly important. Um, a fact about their group membership that they take to be of great practical significance. National identity would be another example. So if you think it's part of your identity that you're an American, or you're Irish, or you're Muslim, or you're a man or a woman, or you're gender fluid, if you think it's a part of your identity that you're any one of these things, right? That's a perfectly, that's you telling people something important about yourself, something you take to be important about yourself. It's a perfectly legitimate way to use the word. It is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is, in a sense, the seemingly far more boring thing, which is just effectively the equal sign. Right? Um, we want to know the conditions under which X is identical to Y, which it's just the same thing as Y, right? So instead of, let's take Superman, fictional character. It's nice to deal with fictional characters in this context because hopefully no one's going to get too worked up about it. Superman, in the sort of common sense of identity, is a Kryptonian because that's, the alien species of which he's a member. He's an American because that's the country his spaceship landed in. Um, and so he became an American citizen. He is a superhero, I guess. Maybe he thinks that's important about himself, or would if he were real. But the sense of identity we're interested in is not, you know, Superman is Kryptonian, Superman is American, Superman is a superhero. What we mean when we're talking about identity in this context, what philosophers usually are interested in when they talk about identity, is the sense of identity in which Clark Kent is identical to Superman. Right? Um, they are the same person. They're two different names for the same person. They're two different ways of identifying the same person. And it doesn't only, right? This isn't a relation that only holds between people. It holds between lots of things, right? So there's water is identical to H2O. The morning star is identical to the evening star. Um, uh, all of these claims are identity claims. And this is the sense of identity we're interested in. You might wonder, like, well, why? The identity where it's your ethnic identity or your national identity or something like that, that's obviously more interesting. Seems like it's also, more problematic. Why talk about this boring, obvious thing? Well, because there's a couple ways in which it's not obvious. And once you see the potential non-obvious things about the identity relation, um, or the non-obvious answers to questions about when two things are identical, you start to see that it's of tremendous practical significance. For my money, this is the area of philosophy that has the greatest practical significance. Um, in a sense, I think this question is the most important, most fundamental question there is for you to ask about yourself, and the answer you give to it shapes everything else you're going to think, but is also shaped by everything else you think. Almost everything is relevant to it, and it's relevant to everything else. Because the main thing that philosophers are interested in when they talk about this is identity over time. Identity over time, or sometimes called diachronic identity. This is unfortunate handwriting. Let me erase that and try again. Diachronic just means over time. Right? But you'll sometimes see people talk about diachronic identity. Right? Now, why does making it over time matter? Well, first, let me explain what we mean by identity over time. Um, we can identify a person who existed 5 years ago. We can look at, all the stuff that was happening to all the people it was happening to 5 years ago, and we can like list all those people. They all have names, or almost all of them. I'm sure there's some 5-year-olds who didn't have names like 5 years ago to the day exactly, or something like that, because their parents just didn't name them right away. My youngest daughter didn't have a name for like a couple days because none of them seemed to fit. But ignoring infants, we can list all the people that existed 5 years ago. We can list all the people that exist right now. And you can ask, which one of those people 5 years ago is you? You, the person right now. So we have sort of two entries on a list. These lists are lists of all the people at different times. Which ones go with which ones? And almost all the time, it's perfectly obvious, right? The person who you correspond to 5 years ago, the person who is you 5 years ago, has your name, um, has many of the same relationships you have now, right? You might think has the same body, although having the same body just means that person's body and your body are identical. So the question just sort of it changes, but it arises again if you say they have the same body. Just it arises in a different way. But you might feel like there's no problem identifying uh, who I was 5 years ago. I was me. I can find me. Right? Someone tells you a story, a sufficiently detailed story about what was happening 5 years ago. You can find yourself. It's not a practical problem almost any of the time. I'll talk about a way it is a practical problem in a little bit. But what we're talking about primarily when we talk about the philosophical problem of personal identity is identity over time. The reason it becomes a philosophical problem is that there is a bit of a puzzle. And the puzzle is, over time, it seems like we change. We don't have all the traits or properties or qualities or features that we have right now. We didn't have all of them 5 years ago. We had some of them, maybe most of them. I don't know how you count the number of properties you have, but you have a lot of similarities to that person. But especially people your age, 5 years ago, you were very different than you are now. You believed different things, you looked different, you acted different. Um, some things were the same, some things were different. And if you take it back 10 years, well, then you look probably very, very different. I looked pretty much the same. A little bit less gray hair. No gray hair, actually, 10 years ago. A few less wrinkles, not many. Um, uh, but the fact that people change over time, seem to, means that you do face a little bit of a problem. And to see the problem, right, consider, and this came up in class, the ship of Theseus. I'm going to draw a boat. Right? There's the ship of Theseus. And suppose, just pretend, the ship of Theseus is on display in some museum. Ship of Theseus is just the ship that Theseus used to get home from Crete to Athens. There's a famous story about it. He got drunk and accidentally uh, didn't do something that would let his father know he hadn't been killed, so his father killed himself. Theseus was too drunk to know. But pretend the ship of Theseus was real, pretend it was on display in some museum, it would be a 3,000-year-old wooden ship. So presumably, however it was preserved thus far, it's not perfectly preserved. So there's going to be some planks of the ship. I'm going to draw some planks on this ship. There's going to be some planks on this ship that have started to rot, to decay, to the point where they're basically rotting away. Now, suppose, right, some janitor at night, every time he notices another plank has gotten rotten, he takes it out and then he replaces it with another plank of wood that he's distressed so it looks like it's the real thing. And he does this once every month or so, right? So like the first one he takes out is this, so I'll color it in. That means that plank has been replaced. Right? Um, you might ask the question, from the day before the janitor started to do this to the day after he started to do this, is it still the same ship? And plausibly it is, right? Like it only changed a little bit. Lots of things change this way that we don't say stop being the same thing. If you were to lose your pinky in an accident, right? It would still be you after the accident, even though some small percentage of the you the day before the accident is now gone. Even if you lost some part of you and had it replaced, like one thing we can do now is we can take tendons out of people and put tendons from other animals in, like a pig tendon or something. Well, you would survive that change. Ship of Theseus survives this change. But what do we say when, through a gradual process, right, the janitor replaces one plank and then another, and then another, and then another, right? And let's pretend it gets to the point where, you know, more than half the planks have been replaced. This is not the best art in the world. Is it still the ship of Theseus? Or is it different? Seems like it could be something of a puzzle. Um, and even if you say it's different, even if you say that's not the ship of Theseus anymore, because most of its body has been replaced, most of the planks that make up the ship have been replaced, you then also have to ask, well, at what point did it stop being the ship of Theseus? Um, well, we change over time too. Not usually through a janitor replacing bits of us, but your body changes over time. Um, uh, as you grow and develop, your body changes in very obvious ways. But even when you're done growing and developing, the individual cells that make up your body will die, get replaced by new cells. The dead cells will get flushed out of your system. Those new cells were made by food you ate, food and water and stuff like that that you ate over time. So all the material of your body gets changed. Similarly, you're psychologically not the same as you were 5 to 10 years ago. There are things that, unless you have some bizarre memory, you can't remember about the day 10 years ago before today, right? December the 9th, 2013 is a day that you probably can't remember much of anything of, but on that day, the you 10 years ago could remember most of the day, hopefully. Um, so that's one way you're psychologically different. You don't remember things that person remembers. So if that person's you, we're going to have to admit there's some level of psychological change we can survive. Your attitudes are different, right? You like different things. You like different music, different TV shows. You have different friends, right? You may have even changed really, really important beliefs that you have, like religious beliefs or something. So we change over time. That leads to a puzzle. What kinds of changes can we survive or not? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about personal identity. Talking about the identity relation, and particularly we're interested about identity over time. Now, the other note I want to make is about personal, or rather persons, because we're interested in what makes one person the same person as someone else. And it's important to realize that the word person does not mean the same thing as human being, right? And that means that this is a little harder a question than you might think. Now, you might wonder, well, why doesn't it? Why doesn't the word person just mean human being? Aren't all human beings persons, and aren't all persons human beings? Well, even if that's true, they don't mean the same thing just because of that. Right? And they don't mean the same thing for a pretty straightforward reason. Um, uh, Even if it is true, which I personally doubt, that all human beings are persons and all persons are human beings, it might not have been true, right? The world could have turned out differently to where there were other persons besides human beings, you might think. Like, suppose Neanderthals hadn't gone extinct, or uh, some other near human uh, hominid, right? That's not a human being, not Homo sapiens, um, uh, had not gone extinct, had developed, right? Had evolved the level of, cognitive abilities we have, the level of they have the same kind of emotional sophistication we have, all these things. And suppose, they evolved far enough that they were persons. I actually tend to think Neanderthals were persons. Probably so were lots of other near human hominids that were distinct species from us. I think that's very likely. Um, uh, but even if you don't think they were, if the world had developed differently, if things had not gone the way they actually did, but if history had just changed slightly, you could have ended up with non-human persons. And then similarly, in the future, there might be non-human persons. Um, Suppose, we go to space, human beings do, and some human beings come to live their entire lives in, very different environments. And so over the course of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, they slowly evolve into a different species, but they maintain all the sort of cognitive, intellectual, emotional traits that we have. I would be willing to say they're persons, but then so would the human beings who still live on Earth, and are still just human beings. They'd be persons too. So, person, even if it is true right now, which I doubt, but even if it is true right now that persons are the only human being, or the only persons are human beings, and all human beings are persons, they still wouldn't mean the same thing. Um, Now, like I've said a couple times, I think there are probably non-human persons right now. For one thing, I think it's very likely that if there are intelligent aliens out there, we should count them as persons. I also tend to think it's possible, although I don't know that we know enough about this. I think it's possible that we should treat some very sophisticated animals as persons. You might be wondering, like, what are you talking about? Well, here's what I'm talking about. The term person, right? If you follow back its uh, sort of the etymology of the term, you end up seeing that it's closely connected with certain other concepts. Right? So, person is a kind of status. Um, and there's two important kinds of status that go along with being a person. One, and they're both a kind of moral status, right? So let's say person is to be a person is to have a certain kind of moral status. And the two ways to see that moral status, or two different aspects of that moral status, are that persons have rights, right? Slash, they are morally significant, just meaning that you can't ignore when you're thinking about what you ought to do its effects on other people, right? Being a person means that you have a moral status where you have to be taken into account. What happens to you matters morally. But it's not just about rights and moral significance. It's also about responsibility. Persons can be blamed for what they do. Uh, Lost a couple letters there. And we can be praised for what they do. We can deserve to be praised. We can deserve to be proud and have other people be proud of us. We can deserve other people blaming us for what we do, hating us for what we do, in a way that other things can't, right? Like if a apple falls off a tree and hits me on the head, not only will I not discover gravity thereby, I might get hurt, right? Especially if it hits in the right way, it might leave a bruise. But I don't blame the apple. I don't blame the apple tree. If a bug walks on my face while I'm asleep, right, and freaks me out, I don't blame the bug. I might kill it. I probably will kill it. But I'm not going to kill it and think, "Hi, you got what you deserved, spider." Um, I hope I didn't give any of you like nightmare fuel with that, but just know that spiders are walking on you while you sleep. Uh, so not everything that can harm us and not everything that can benefit us is responsible for what it does. Persons are, though. And that's what I mean when I say I think if there are intelligent aliens out there, which almost certainly there are, I think probably, depending on how they work, they count as persons. Like when you watch Star Trek, when you watch Star Wars, when you watch these kinds of sci-fi shows and movies, what you're seeing are alien people. They deserve to be treated in certain ways that non-persons don't deserve to be treated. And when I say sufficiently intelligent animals right now on Earth might be persons, what I mean is like I think maybe we have to treat like whales, maybe some birds like crows, uh, some of the higher primates like chimpanzees, orangutans, things like that. I think we might have to treat them at least as having moral rights, right? It matters what we do to them. Maybe all animals do. I wouldn't personally go that far. I think if you step on a slug, there's no moral consequence to that at all, except that you might ruin your shoes. So, person doesn't mean the same thing as human being. Um, it might be true that persons are the only human beings. It might be true that all human beings are persons, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Similarly, person doesn't isn't like just another word for body. Right? It might turn out that the best theory of personal identity is that you are identical to a body, but that doesn't. It's not a matter of meaning. It's not what the word means. So when we ask about personal identity, we're asking what allows a certain kind of thing to exist over time, to continue to exist over time. And here's where I get to the practical significance of it. I've just been saying, but I think maybe there are non-human persons. I also think it's plausible. I don't know if I believe this or not, but what I believe doesn't matter. Some people definitely do believe this. That there are non-person human beings. So think about someone who's uh, suffered severe brain trauma. Okay? Let's say they were caught in an explosion, and the explosion ripped their brain apart. And the only part of their brain that still functions is the part of their brain that handles sort of involuntary activities like they breathe, their heart beats, the all the like the lower stuff, right? The less interesting stuff in a way. Um, so they stay alive. They're still a living human being, but they don't have any thoughts anymore. They don't feel anything. They have no conscious awareness of anything. They don't dream. right? And they'll never do any of these things again because the part of their brain that allowed them to do that is just like irretrievably, uh, irreparably destroyed. Um, I think it's at least plausible that that's a human being who's not a person. The person didn't survive the accident; their body did, but the person didn't. Right? Whatever caused the brain damage. Much more controversial is what happens if there's not an accident, but there's just like degradation. What happens to people who are suffering from severe dementia? They've lost all their memories and their personality is completely different. Maybe they can't even talk anymore. Not clear that they can think in any coherent way. Are they still a person? Um, some people say no. And this is a question of what can a person survive? What kind of changes can you undergo that will leave you in existence after the change? And what kinds won't, right? Um, uh, is someone who, has a lobotomy performed, is that still them afterwards? It's still their body, but go watch One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? And ask yourself, is Jack Nicholson's character, is he still there after the lobotomy? Or is it just his body, stumbling around? Um, but another way, so I mean, this is of practical importance all on its own, right? If someone's mind is gone forever, and they were your friend or they were your loved one, is your friend or loved one still there, or is it just their body? Does that distinction make sense? Even. But another way in which it's important, the way that I'm personally most interested in, is what would it mean? Like, is it possible for a person to survive death, the death of their body? Many people believe they can. They believe that when you die, after some period of time, maybe immediately, maybe not, you go to heaven. Your body goes to, maybe your body gets, resurrected if you're a sort of mainstream Christian, or maybe you believe that your soul separates from your body and goes to heaven, or um, maybe you believe in reincarnation. Your soul leaves your body and goes into another body. Uh, so these are sort of religious accounts of how a person that involve a person surviving death. And this is in many ways very pleasant because it holds out the possibility that all your loved ones who died, all the people in your life who died, you'll one day see them again. You'll one day interact with them, the very same person again, and not that you'll interact with some copy that God made. Right? But people have worried about this. If you die, and I'll take the traditional Catholic view here. The traditional Catholic view, mainstream Catholic view. This is something I'm not sure most Catholics know, but the traditional Catholic view is you die and you get resurrected. Let's say you're one of the good people. You're going to join, Jesus in the kingdom of heaven. If Catholics are right, you die, and then your body gets resurrected at the end of days. And in between, well, that's unclear, right? Some Catholic theologians have thought that in between, your soul exists separately from your body and resides in some kind of other realm, or maybe your soul sleeps while your body breaks down and decays. Some thought you just don't exist after your death, but before the resurrection. You're just not present. You existed, you stopped existing, and then you start existing again. But some people have wondered, well, if that's the way it goes, that sounds like I die, I cease to exist, and then at the end of days, God makes a perfect copy of me. And it's a new person, but it's a person who's just like I was when I died, except hopefully healthier. Right? Um, is that kind of process one I can survive? If you think about reincarnation, right? Suppose the way it works is you have some kind of immaterial soul, and after you die, your immaterial soul becomes untethered from your now dead body and goes and gets itself into another body, like Plato thought, or like, many people believe. Many Buddhists believe this, many Hindus believe this. Lots of religious traditions coming out of the Indian subcontinent believe this. Well, does that soul have the same personality, the same memories, the same beliefs, the same values um, that you did when you were alive? Does it carry that over to the next body? And if not, how is that still you if they're nothing like you? Especially if, you believe like Plato that when your soul leaves your body and ends up in a dog, right? Well, like that dog definitely doesn't have your beliefs. Dogs don't have beliefs like that of the kind you do. So, a lot of very common beliefs about the afterlife raise interesting questions about whether people can survive that change, whether the stories even make sense. Even apart from having evidence that they're true, do they even make sense? Um, but there are also non-religious stories people are telling themselves about the afterlife. People are, trying to come up with technologies that will allow you to survive your death, maybe by transferring your brain to another body, but more plausibly, digitizing the contents of your brain and transferring that information into a computer or into another body that was maybe grown for you. There's sci-fi stories about this kind of thing. Altered Carbon is such a story. Well, is that is that a way of keeping you alive, or again, is that just making a copy of you, someone who's a lot like you, but not you? These are, I think, the practical questions, because these questions go right to the heart of, our deepest concerns, which is usually to stay alive and our relationships with people around us. Like it's no secret why it's popular to believe in an afterlife. It holds out the hope that not only you, but everyone you love will continue on and your relationships will continue on and they'll develop and they'll grow even after you die. But does that make sense? Well, to figure out whether that makes sense, you have to figure out what accounts for, what explains identity over time. What kinds of things, what kinds of changes can a person survive? What kinds of changes can they not survive? And there are lots of different theories. And what the Bernard Williams article is doing is it's responding to a particular kind of theory, a theory that became very popular after a philosopher named John Locke wrote about it. But I think I'm actually going to make that a separate video. I said this was going to be a long video. I think I'm actually going to make several videos about this. And for that, I apologize, but I think it's necessary to sort of set things up.